We'll now move to our final speaker of the evening, Geoff Tibbs. Geoff is a peace campaigner from the Peace Pledge Union, a non-governmental organisation that promotes pacifism. Every year before Remembrance Day, the Peace Pledge Union distributes white poppies, which have been worn since the 1930s as a symbol of peace and remembrance for all victims of war. In his other work, Geoff is a painter and a magician and has edited several volumes of creative writing. Geoff, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you very much for having me today. I'm abstaining from this motion, not because remembrance doesn't matter to me and not because I don't have a view on it, but because I find it too binary. This house would not wear the poppy suggests that there is something that we all mean by the poppy, the red poppy, and that the choice whether or not to wear it is a choice between marking Remembrance Day and not marking it at all. But an alternative is possible. And perhaps that's the big difference between what I'm saying and what some of the previous speakers have said. I think an alternative is possible. It already exists. I work for the Peace Pledge Union. We distribute white poppies around Remembrance Time. And you can see me wearing one now. And I hope I can convince you in the next few minutes that an alternative to the mainstream tradition is badly needed. Another reason that I'm abstaining is that we don't campaign against people wearing the red poppy because we recognize, as many people have said, the personal meanings that people bring to it. We wouldn't want to criticize them, nor the people who wear both white and red poppies. My criticisms are aimed at the institution of remembrance. That's what you see on TV, that's what you see at the cenotaph, that's what the government and the armed forces promote. So firstly, I'll say something about that institution, and then I'll outline some of the problems with it, and then I'll talk about the alternative. So people have already summed this up probably better than I could. The language of nationalism that was originally used to create the remembrance tradition around 100 years ago, the 2-minute silence, the procession at the cenotaph and so on, is still very familiar today. Sacrifice, freedom, honor, bravery, victory, gratitude. If you want to know what remembrance officially means, you can look at the website of the Royal British Legion, who distribute the red poppies. I quote, "Remembrance honors those who serve to defend our democratic freedoms and way of life. We pay tribute to the men and women of the Second World War generation and to those of today's who have served and sacrificed to defend our nation." The features of this institution, I think, are not very surprising. They're common to many countries: the nationalism, the celebration of the armed forces, the specific focus on military victims of war on a given side, on one side of a given conflict. Often people, and it's happened a few times tonight, often people accuse the red poppy of glorifying war. I personally think this slightly misses the point. The issue is a much deeper one. It's a structural issue to do with who has the right to frame, to talk about, and to represent a shared memory of war and violence. Who owns that memory? And when you turn on the TV on Remembrance Sunday, you get a very clear answer to that question: the armed forces, allied organisations like the Royal British Legion, and the government and the royal family following their lead. So what do I think are the problems with this? Firstly, by focusing almost exclusively on British and allied military victims of war, remembrance excludes the vast majority of victims of war. This has already been said. Civilians, even during the Second World War, the majority of people who died were civilians. Today, the civilian losses often form an even greater proportion. Some studies say as many as 90% of people who die in war are civilians. I'm not saying civilians are never included, sometimes they get a mention, but as the majority of people who suffer and die in war are civilians, their voices and experiences should rightly be at the centre of remembrance. More rarely mentioned are the victims of war of other nationalities, unless they happen to have been allied to the UK in war. In an era of asymmetrical warfare, where weaker states often suffer far more than stronger ones, such as the UK, this omission is really glaring. Where are the voices of the civilian victims of recent wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen now, on Remembrance Day? I hope that one question by itself is enough to make anyone think again about the mainstream tradition. This points to a second issue. which is just the selective memory, which people have already talked about. Remembrance does promote a highly selective version of British history. Whether or not you think of that the language of heroism, of sacrifice, of democracy is a helpful approach to the First and Second World Wars, I doubt there are many people watching this today who would be prepared to defend the colonial conflicts before and since in those moral terms, nor the more recent conflicts I've already mentioned. And the result of this selective memory is, of course, a narrow and morally sanitized vision of British history. To take just one example, last year, if you went on the Royal British Legion's website, you might have come across a history page with an account of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. And how can anyone write such an account without only mentioning the 12 British troops who died and saying nothing of the thousands of Kenyans killed, tortured, and thrown into camps? Another example, this year the government urged us to commemorate the 75th anniversary of VJ Day with celebrations and tea parties and so on. In their statements on their webpage, there was barely a mention of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What possible purpose does this selective memory serve, other than perhaps to shelter the UK's current nuclear arsenal from scrutiny? To clarify, I'm not saying that British military victims of war should not be remembered. Of course they should, but so should civilians, so should people of other nationalities, so should those who the government and the powerful find it convenient to forget. And this points to a third issue. So long as Remembrance Day continues to be framed in military terms, perpetuating selective memory about the past, it lends implicit support to the actions of the armed forces today and excludes any critical perspectives on their role around the world. I'll come back to this in a moment. So what's the alternative? An alternative already exists. The idea of an alternative to the red poppy is almost as old as the red poppy itself. It dates back to the 1920s, and the white poppy dates from 1933. It was created by women from the Women's Cooperative Guild who had lost loved ones in the First World War. And it was created to try to hold on to the never again message that they saw as the original and the true message of remembrance. It's been worn ever since then, recently in greater and greater numbers, and it stands for three things. Firstly, remembrance for all victims of war, both civilian and military, of all nationalities. It's a kind of remembrance that centers the voices and experiences of those who suffer and die in war. That in a way is its leading principle. Secondly, it challenges militarism, any attempt to normalize or celebrate or glorify armed force. Thirdly, it stands for a culture of peace. It is a reminder to those who wear it of the value of a peaceful society, a peaceful foreign policy, and a peaceful world, and that these things can't be taken for granted, but require our active participation and resistance. Any money raised from white poppies goes to the campaigning and education work that the Peace Pledge Union does the year round, opposing war and promoting peaceful alternatives, whether that's by disrupting arms fairs in central London, or the No Pride in War campaign, which pressures arms companies to withdraw their sponsorship of pride marches, or our peace education work, which attempts to open up discussions such as the one we're having tonight around remembrance in schools. Many groups also collect donations locally to pass on to charities and campaigns of their choice. This year, we launched the White Poppy campaign by calling on everyone to remember Yemen. The humanitarian catastrophe there has gone from bad to worse, exacerbated recently by the COVID-19 pandemic. This man-made disaster has already led to the worst cholera epidemic in recent history, and the UN have very recently warned that the country is on the brink of losing a whole generation of young children to starvation and malnutrition as a result of the Saudi blockade. This blockade is enforced with British armaments. The RAF trains Saudi pilots. The UK government has recently allowed the resumption of arms sales to the Saudi regime. It is not possible to remember the victims of this conflict without confronting our government's responsibility for the crisis and asking ourselves what we can do to end it. I mentioned at the beginning that my criticisms are aimed at the institution of remembrance, not individuals. In fact, it would look like public opinion is very much on the side of the messages behind the white poppy. Last year, we commissioned a poll from an independent company of public attitudes towards remembrance, which showed that the vast majority of people, around 85%, think that both civilians and people of other nationalities should be included on Remembrance Day. A similar proportion think Remembrance Day should have a central message of peace. It is the institution that is out of step. Every year, we distribute white poppies through local groups, community spaces, places of worship around the UK. Alternative remembrance events are held at war memorials. If you agree with the principles that I've outlined, that remembrance should draw on the experiences of all victims of war, that it should be open to inconvenient truths and critical perspectives, and that it should mark a commitment to peace, then I urge you to get involved and join in, as well as, of course, to vote for the abstention. Thank you.